Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. And what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. For our conversation today, we are joined by our special guest, Judith Blackstone, who you may remember is one of our mentors. Judith is an innovative teacher in contemporary spirituality. She developed the realization process, an embodied approach to personal and relational healing and non-dual realization. She's also author of several books, including her latest work, Trauma and the Unbound Body. In our talk, we speak about a subtle field of awareness within each of us that Judith calls fundamental consciousness. Together, we cover how traumatic experiences are unconsciously bound into constrictions in our bodies, limiting both our personal expression and our experience of ourselves as wholeness, as well as how when we discover ourselves as fundamental consciousness, we can experience ourselves as an unbreakable, unified ground of being. Of course, we also speak about how the realization process has changed both of our lives and how ultimately these practices can mean the end of objectification and codependency. If you've been enjoying the show, we would love your support. If you head over and leave a review on iTunes, people really get to find us so much easier. It helps the word spread, and it's good for us on every level. You can also go over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to read our blog, get our weekly digest, or find out more about becoming one of our supporting members on Patreon, which is the most amazing thing since we are a listener-supported podcast. One last thing before we head into conversation. I think once in this episode, I might have cursed. So just in case you're in mixed, non-swearing company, feel free to pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Welcome, Judith, and hi, Brooke.
Hello.
We are really excited, as if you're watching, you can see by my smile and the giddy laugh I'm going to probably have any minute now, because we get to have one of our teachers and our mentors, Judith Blackstone, on the show with us today.
Thank you.
It's a little mini reunion. It's so nice.
Yeah, if y'all have been listening to the show for a while, you know that we studied with Judith. We did her certification, one of her certifications. She offers more than one. And it was life-changing for us, most importantly. I think that's what we want to try to bring through to the best of our ability today, Judith, because you've written many books now. You have your newest book out, Trauma and the Unbound Body, but Judith is not new to writing and authoring wonderful books, and you are extremely articulate and your ideas come through very clear. And we thought, let's see what we can't do to bring the most experiential version of your work through today.
Sure. Yeah.
So I wanted to start with a quote that you started this new book with, because it struck to the core of what has changed in my life. And I thought we can start there. So Judith writes, wholeness is not a vague ideal, but a lived experience. It is a potential inherent in our human nature. To be whole is to be conscious and in contact with ourselves everywhere in our body, to live within our body. When we inhabit our body, we experience ourselves as an undivided consciousness, a subtle, unified ground of consciousness, pervading our whole body and our environment at the same time. And this felt like a beautiful place to begin our conversation, because the number one thing that when I attempt to describe what had shifted in my life through doing the realization process and working with you, Judith, was I feel whole. And I feel real. And I feel like I exist. And those are funny words, right? Because in a way, especially people in the enlightenment circles or the awakening circles, it's like, well, you've always been whole. You've always existed. You know, how is
it? You've never been real.
Right, that too. And also you don't exist.
Exactly. And so it's like, how is it that one can feel fragmented, even though we all would agree there is this baseline wholeness? So I thought we could begin there. What does it mean to feel and come to know yourself as wholeness? And how is it that somewhere along the line we came to perceive ourselves as not whole or fragmented?
Okay, well, those are two big questions. Yeah. Wholeness is pretty much, I don't think I would say anything differently than what you read. It means we can get to wholeness by living within our body. Now, where do we live if we don't live within our body?
Yeah,
that's the question,
right? We live in front of ourselves mostly, right? If we're pretty adept at getting away, we live above ourselves or even to the side watching, and self-consciously watching ourselves. Right? To actually inhabit the body and be in contact with ourselves everywhere within that internal space of the body turns out to be an advanced experience, a marker of personal maturity and even spiritual awakeness. And that's just how it is. We none of us apparently grow up living within our body. Now, you ask why? Why is because from the very first moment of our lives, and possibly before, or the first moment after our birth, we are organizing ourselves in reaction to our environment. And this is a normal thing to do. It's not pathological. We can't call it pathological because we all do it. And we organize ourselves for several reasons. One is protectively. The main one is probably protectively, right? And the sensitive people in the audience will recognize that feeling that, the lights are too bright, the sounds are too loud, the emotions are very hard to process, they're very confusing, very intense. And so we dampen the impact of experience by actually closing off our body, which is the instrument of our experience, to that impact. And we can do it very subtly so that it barely affects, or we don't really know that it's affected our life later on as adults. This is something we do mostly in childhood, somewhat in adolescence, and then if there's really strong impacts, called trauma, later on in adulthood, we may do it again in adulthood. But mostly in childhood, we can just simply dull our hearing just the slightest little bit, right? So that, we can still hear, no one would call us deaf, but it's just a little bit, closed off to the impact of sound. We can close off our vision. We can close down our heart just with the slightest internal movement, someone that most people would not see and not be aware of personally within their own bodies. And then we have just closed off a little bit of our ability to feel pain in response to our environment, just with that little bit of movement. What it means is that when we then, as adults, through practices, go to open all that, we're like, oh my God, I had no idea the world was so beautiful, so vivid. Sounds are so beautiful. My emotional life is so free. I feel love without even trying to. because we have closed that off just that little bit of amount. So the main reason is protectively. We also hold back any sort of our internal experience and reactions, such as our love or unhappiness or our tears or our hunger or our longing or our anger or fear, if those responses to our environment are going to be met with danger, with lack of mirroring, lack of nurture, any of those things, lack of approval. The child is just intent on being loved, approved of, thriving. We actually do this to keep ourselves intact so that we're not shattered by experience, right? So this is just part of our healthy survival mechanism, that we sacrifice little bits of ourselves in order to stay mostly intact, right? So it's still very interesting to me that we cannot close off any aspect of our experience without tightening the body.
Yeah.
Right. So we go to hold back tears. That's not a mental process. It might start as a mental process, but I don't know where it starts, but it involves the anatomy of crying, right? We can't keep food out without closing off the anatomy involved in food. We can't keep ourselves from smelling, whiskey on a parent's breath or some smell that seems unpleasant to us, car fumes, whatever, without actually shutting down the anatomy involved in that ability to smell, to take in sense. So those are the two main reasons. A couple more. We also comply with expectations and commands. Right? Sit still. Don't be so loud. Don't be so smart. A lot of you will recognize that one. Well, how do we stop from being so smart? We really can. But unfortunately, only by either actually pressing down a little bit on our thinking ability or closing off our expression of our smartness, right? By actually tightening just a little bit in our throat. And we almost all have that. We've held back. That's a very popular one. We've held back our voice.
I never thought of that as an expression of your smartness. That was clarifying to hear that.
Yeah, well, don't be a smart ass, one of the ways we can deal with that is to keep being smart, but just not let anyone know.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so it's the expression of that we might control. And then the last reason I'll mention for organizing ourselves, for shutting ourselves down to some extent, is to mirror our parents' openness and defense, our parents' pattern of organization. Now, most of us have more than one parent. We have aunts and uncles, grandparents, brothers, sisters. So it's a little mysterious what we choose to mirror and what we don't. But there's definitely familial patterns, right? The whole family is thinking, we all live up here, but not so much emotional. That's messy, and private. So we all living, it's a very simple correlation. What functions and qualities of ourselves have been allowed to blossom and where we live in ourselves, right? So we're allowed to be intelligent. We live up here in our head, but not so much in our chest, right? Or we simply fragment. We make a little division, again, usually in the neck, between our thinking and our feelings, so we can do one or the other, but not both at once so much, right? So all of those little organizations that go on, again, that most of us can live perfectly normal lives. In other words, we can love, we can have, lovers and spouses, children,
spicy
everything.
Spouses.
If
we want.
Right. Many spouses. And feel like, everything's fine. Everything's fine. It's just actually when we start to get to, sometimes we get a little, depression or anxiety or something, and we decide, like, I don't really want to live with this amount of depression. And no, it's actually not necessary to live with it. And so these embodiment practices of the realization process, as well as the release technique that is part of the realization process can help with that. But really, the main purpose of the realization process is for us to embody ourselves more and more completely, to have more of ourselves. And in doing that, to be able to open more fully to what we can experience as a pervasive ground, very, very subtle consciousness. I call it fundamental consciousness in the realization process, pervading ourselves and our environment as a unity, right? So again, wonderful thing in nature, hardly ever talked about because it takes little doing, that as we become whole within ourselves and that inner contact everywhere, it's at the same time openness, we become one with everything around us. So whole within ourselves, one with everything around us.
Yeah, I think it was one of the things that really differentiates the realization process is that you're speaking very directly about a refinement of consciousness, and that consciousness is really here and that it's something we can develop, I would say, a relationship with, but also to discover that it's not a thing, right? Like it's not a separate object that we need to have a relationship with, that it
That's right.
is us. And, I would say for myself in doing this work, that cultivating that awareness has been, life-changing for me. And I'm thinking of one of my very first experiences of it in a training with you, where we were doing a partner exercise, a very simple one at the beginning of just sitting across from somebody and they were to talk about something fairly benign, what they had just had for lunch or something. Mm-hmm. And so the exercise was for me as the listener to be able to inhabit my body, which of course we had done a bunch of training around, and listen at the same time. And what I discovered really surprised me, which was that I felt like I was really seeing her. Yes. And like I was having the experience of really seeing someone for the first time. So she's talking about whatever she had for breakfast or where she planned on walking that afternoon. And I'm like falling in love with her, which was the other interesting thing, is like really seeing her and really being there and in relationship with myself, with her, and with this whole field of fundamental consciousness also evoked this like, I am just so in love with you right now. Like, you're amazing. But it is like the dreamlike quality of life goes away and you're like, wow, this is amazing.
Yes.
Which I think is so profound about your work, because I think sometimes people can hear talks about refining consciousness and it sounds like maybe this fancy spiritual goal, but what you're talking about is actually coming to life.
Coming to life. Absolutely. We're coming to life. And in relationship, it's wonderful because yes, the veils dissipate, they fall away, more and more, gradually, more and more. But also we remain in contact with ourselves as we feel this very, very deep contact with other people. One thing that's not often talked about in terms of what I'm calling fundamental consciousness, which has actually been mentioned in several traditional, although rather advanced, realization lineages in Buddhism and Hinduism particularly, where it has many different names. But because it's been considered a spiritual experience, and rather advanced spiritual experience, it's not often talked about how it does bring us to life, and also how it's the basis of contact. Right? Because I don't think those gurus on their mountains were all that interested in contact, or would have framed it in that way. They might have been interested. They might have been like, wow, me and this tree are like, love. But never really, that part didn't kind of get into the traditional writings. But that's what it is. It's the basis. One of the things it is, basis of contact. So everywhere that we feel it in our own body, we're in contact with ourselves. That means we're in contact with our love, with our intelligence, with our expression, our pleasure, right? Even our physical pleasure, everything, our sense of power, all of those what seem like innate qualities of our being come to life as we contact ourselves, which is another interesting thing about our nature, right? That those qualities just seem to be there in our body, waiting to be open to. And at the same time, it's the basis of our contact with other human beings. So we feel love to love, right? Intelligence to intelligence, pleasure to pleasure, a power to power, voice to voice, as we know ourselves as that field of oneness. For sensitive people, particularly important, most of us tend to either completely lose ourselves in the other person, and anyway, anything for love, right? What you want, anything, just love me, right? But even energetically, we tend to fall out of ourselves and merge with other human beings, or we protect against that, close ourselves up. I have to preserve me, and so the only way I can do that is to shut you out, because otherwise I know we're just going to be all smushed up together. But as this fundamental consciousness, we have contact with our own being at the same time as with other people. That's our true boundaries.
Yeah. It was sort of mind-blowing for me to discover that I could inhabit my body and still have awareness of others, because my pattern was this diffuse, energetic, almost like I could visualize this for myself even before I found your work, that it was like if I was even sitting with a client, in order to understand them, I could imagine as if I was leaving my body and going into theirs.
Yes.
And then I would get kind of the lay of the land and then come back to my body, but not really to my body, probably to the front of my body or something like this. So I really felt on some level that that's what has to be done, because without that, I couldn't relate. I couldn't be empathically involved. But of course, simultaneously, I had tremendous issues with being around people. They were always, I thought people were exhausting. It turns out it wasn't them, right? And I remember, Judith, being in your training, and I was talking about how trees have the easiest energy to read. Doesn't everyone read trees? They're so, and Judith was like, well, actually, no, they're more subtle than people. You may just have a couple of issues around relating with people. And so since I found skin on my body, and found safety in inhabiting my own body and being, what has unfolded was I can be around people and I can work with clients, most notably, and not be tired at the end of my day. In fact, be rejuvenated.
Wonderful. Yeah. One of the things that I teach in the psychotherapy aspect of the training, which I call healing ground, right? It's also the basis of our empathy, is that as fundamental consciousness, we're not reading other people either by going over there to them or by running their pain through our own body, which is also very tiring and confusing. But actually we can, to some extent, see, feel what's going on in them over there in their body while remaining in our own body. In other words, across distance, right? And even a sense, and I feel like even if we're not working with people as therapists, healing people, just in relating, that knowing, that's seeing and feeling who a person is, what it might be like to be that person in their head and their heart, right? Quality of their emotional life, part of our real connection with other human beings, right? Part of our deep connection.
Yeah. One of as we go back to talk about the constrictions a little bit more specifically, and it's just worth saying, Vanessa and I have said this on other shows, and we've talked with you about it, Judith. Historically, our choices, Vanessa and I, are the opposite ends of a spectrum, still not inhabiting ourselves. She's the underbound. I'm the overbound. So it's just kind of fun. Both of us feel pretty balanced these days, but it's just fun to mention because we get to be examples for anyone listening of, that you can find balance, but also that there are these different flavors that we might have of still not being whole and not inhabiting ourselves, but we, choose different patterns. But, so I really relate very strongly to the title of your new book, The Unbound Body. Just reading those words is like, oh yeah, because I was such a, densely bound, armored type. And the way you talk about the constrictions makes so much sense to me, because as I've done your work, as I've inhabited myself more, it's like the field of experience opens up, as I was kind of describing in the example from class. But I get to have that experience all the time where it's safe to be in the space, in the world. Like there's something else here than just me protecting myself. And one of the places of nuance with the constriction work that I thought you wrote about beautifully in the new book, and also that we experienced in a really interesting way in the training, is about how we can kind of hijack, you wouldn't use that word necessarily, but hijack our senses, how the constriction in our senses, our ability to really, see out of our eyes or smell, or constricting the sense of touch or even longing to be touched, I think is so fascinating, because of course it just feels like us. We don't realize that we have these blind spots in our ability to sense our world.
That's right. And it feels like the way the world is.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. It's not until we start to open that we realize the world is different than that it's more vivid, more luminous, right? Yeah. And even more permeable, more transparent as this fundamental consciousness, as we open to that. So yes, we bind our senses, and it's very moving, to work with people. And sometimes to look in the eyes, for one thing, you can see the child, right? You can see the child in the held child, the arrested development, that we all have, every one of us. And sometimes you can really see it in the eyes. And sometimes you can actually, there's like a held sadness or fear, or anger within the eyes that you can see they're still held in that position of looking at something that was really horrifying for them or extremely saddening for them when they were children, right? So that even, the memory and the feeling and the constriction all held there and visible in the eyes and in all of the senses. Yeah. Closing off the touch, it's a big one. Anyone who's been physically, punished by being hit, or especially hit out in anger, lashed out in anger, beaten, as many people unfortunately are, will often have learned to close off to the pain of that, as well as to the humiliation and the grief, disconnection from the parent, all of that.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot we could say even just about the senses, because we saw in working within a group with you, this isn't as subtle as people think it is. Like once you really bring your attunement to it, like we saw people come out of the past into the present in their eyes, right? Yeah. And you have a lot of practices people can find in your books and in some of your telecourses and programs where you can hear as fundamental consciousness and see as fundamental consciousness. So this isn't as intangible as it may sound to some of you listening. And we started to touch on this, but this feels important to say off the bat for some reason in a really clear way. Without a conscious thought, it seemed to me in my life very unsafe to exist in my body. Very unsafe to inhabit my body. And for all of those reasons you said in the beginning, Judith, probably mirroring my parents, getting the sense I didn't want to be seen for multiple reasons, right? These chronic repetitive patterns, wanting to be hypervigilant, to hear everything in the atmosphere and sense when my dad might be turning directions on me, right? So for all of these reasons, and probably ones I may not know, my internal sense was it's not safe to be here in my body. Yeah. And yet when we went through the work, what I got out of it and what you also teach is it was the safest place I could be. Yes. That to inhabit my being is in fact the safest place I could be. And it only took a little bit of practice and a few exercises with you in front of the group for my body to get that and for my being to get that it was safe to be here. And I wonder if we can speak to that, if we can speak to safety and the safety that is found most profoundly when you are inhabiting the fullness of your body?
Yeah. So there's a lot to be said for that. That contact with oneself, there's so many things. We can't be, one of the things we fear is that we're going to be overwhelmed and eradicated by other human beings, right? We've been overpowered as children. Sensitive people, we anyway feel a little flimsier than other people. They seem like really potent or something. We can get real flat, feels like life is just impinging right on us, as if we have no buffer at all. But as we make internal contact with ourselves, we have an actual experience of taking up space. We take up space. We have internal volume. For me, that was amazing, that I would take up as much space as this other person who seems so potent. It was wonderful. And right there, the space is not empty space. It's made of aliveness, right? That consciousness feels alive. That contact with ourselves feels alive. So we have a palpable sense of our own existence. We also have a kind of cushion, life, for one thing, as fundamental consciousness, we have a sense of being made of consciousness at the same time as we're substantial. So it means that vibration can move through us without hitting on us. Right? You can allow it to move through. And this gives us a kind of resilience, to be able to let sounds just go through us, even emotional vibes, even anger, can go through us. We don't have to hold on to it. So there's safety in that. There's safety in these qualities. If one thing about having foundation, right? We have foundation. A lot of this sense of feeling unsafe is because as children, when we were yelled at or something confusing happened, we were knocked off our base, right? It's very easy to pull the rug out from a 3-year-old, right? To be knock them off their foundation. But as fundamental consciousness, as inhabiting our body, that contact, we have actual sense of foundation. Our feet are foundation, the base of our torso. We can find foundation in the respiratory diaphragm, base of our neck, right? The top of our head can rest, so that everything is kind of resting internally on a foundation. We cannot be knocked off base very easily at all. Mm-hmm. Then there's the qualities, is actually feeling the quality of power. We feel it in our midsection, but actually it's everywhere in our body. It's an actual feeling, right? When we inhabit the midsection, which by that I mean between your ribs and your pelvis, that whole area, it's an area many of us leave out, that midsection, just to get in there. Then we have automatically, in the realization process, we attune to the quality of power, but actually just by inhabiting that part of your body, you may feel that quality of power. Now, power has been a dangerous thing for many of us to feel, and a taboo kind of thing. But for a child to feel power, well, an adult will come back with much stronger power than that. Mm-hmm. So your power doesn't mean anything. Not only that, but of course, women in particular are taught that nobody likes a powerful woman. Even today, it's a little bit hard. Not that easy. It's getting much better than it was. But, powerful woman, not all that attractive. Right? Men, so many men today squelch their power, their feeling of their power and their midsection because they've seen, abuses of power in their own gender, right? So they don't want to be that kind of man, right? And they're not that kind of man. And so they squelch their power. So to bring it back, it feels like, we're breaking a little bit of taboo there. But we can. It's right there in our body. We can feel it. And when we feel it, well, it's safe. It's safe. We have power. Love, we feel love. There's a lot of safety in that. We see people, oh God, they're so confused, their emotions, what are we going to do? So many of us are primed to, if I see someone else's emotion, and of course, sensitive people can see other people's emotions very easily, then I'm responsible to help them, or that's going to turn into anger on a dime. Right away, it's going to be anger, But when we feel love, we have immediately compassion. You're right, like you're saying, right? So you have to feel that connection. You really see that person. You really love that person, right? Well, maybe they're angry, maybe they're confused. One wonderful Tibetan teacher once said that compassion is seeing through confusion. Seeing through confusion.
That's great.
Yeah, great. Trungpa Rinpoche had a lot of great things to say years ago. Right, seeing through confusion. Well, as fundamental consciousness, we can see through confusion, and we can sit in our heart. That can't be dislodged. The actual sense of sitting in our heart, being in love all the time, right? Whether or not there's someone there that we actually in a love relationship with, right? Yeah. So all of that.
And you described in the book something about, as we can inhabit the core of our being, that there is this sense of distance or perspective. And that was one of the things I was lacking, was any sense of distance from anything. Which, people were describing to me, like I took up too much space in a room, or they felt overwhelmed by me, all these things. And here I am, little old me. I'm just scared and trying to make everyone like me. Like, what? How could this be? And that's, you get a sense of distance and perspective, which can help in all sorts of ways to cushion, as you described, and also to begin to see the constrictions from a level of awareness that this is not me, that these are ways that things have become bound.
That's right. And we're truly centered in the core of our being. So this core, right, that you're referring to, it's conceived of in both Buddhism and Hinduism, and probably other cultures as well, as a very subtle channel that runs through the vertical core of our torso, neck, and head. It's called Sushumna in the Hindu yogic system. The chakras are along it. It's called the central channel. That's obviously an English translation. In Tibetan Buddhism. So yes, many deep spiritual lineages have recognized this core of our being. In the realization process, we have very specific practices for contacting that, for alivening it with the breath, and then alivening and when we do that, we actually get to a very subtle level of our energy system, which is also very nice. But it does, living in that core, give us that real perspective on life, right? And there's another wonderful thing about nature that, was very good news for me, is that the deepest contact with ourselves is the greatest distance from other people, and at the same time, our entranceway into oneness with them, right? So we don't have to come out to them. We don't have to be smushed with them. We can be cross distance in our core to core. Another interesting thing is that the core of our own being resonates with the core of all other beings, especially human beings, most easy to feel with other human beings, right? So if two people have found that internal depth of themselves, there's automatically a resonance that feels like real contact, right? So that's distance. And yes, also from that core, we're right in the center of all our experience, right? So we go home for Thanksgiving dinner and everybody's doing their usual old number. And instead of getting drawn into it, we're in our core, it's just swirling around us, and we can see it much more easily. Oh, she needs that. That's why she's pulling on that. He's doing that. He feels frustrated about that. We're right in the core, observing and responding, but not pulled in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you're talking, I think it's really clear how, one of the things you point to in your book is that there are many practices for becoming aware of the body, but that inhabiting the body is really quite different than being aware of the body. And I entered your work from, many, many years of work in aware of the body kind of work. And so you discover, wow, this is really a whole rich, universe in here to inhabit the body. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about the importance of, because you talk about the release process, which is in the realization process, and that this is how we unbind these unique constrictions that we all have as a normal part of being human. But that you work with people to really be able to inhabit their bodies before they're doing the release work. And so I'm curious if you could just talk about why and what might be the risk of doing release work before you're able to really know what it means or feels like to inhabit the body.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. There are many, many techniques out there for releasing, right? For emotional release. I think a contribution of the realization process to that lineage of emotional release work is that when we release, because we've already done the practices for inhabiting the body and knowing ourselves as this unbreakable fundamental consciousness, that we release not into just the void, not into nothingness, which can be kind of scary and it releases a lot of energy, and there we are with all that energy. But rather we let go into this ground of our being that we've already contacted. So there's really something to catch us. We become more of ourselves, right? In a very palpable way. We are able to claim and in that way also maintain, which is another issue with release work. We're able to maintain that release because as it joins with the rest of our ability to embody the body, we possess it. It becomes more of our internal territory in a way, right? So right away we've claimed it, and we won't probably lose it, not nearly as easily, right? So the release technique really depends upon the ability also because in the release technique, we use a very subtle focus for contacting. One of the things about this release technique is we work to find the exact pathways of the constriction. Mm-hmm. In my early training, many years ago, I was taught to take a rubber bat and hit a pillow, right, as hard as I could and say the worst possible things that I could think of, right? And that was effective. But I feel like this realization process release technique is like the great granddaughter of that work, where we're finding the exact pathway that we actually used for the constriction and releasing that. And for that, we need some subtlety, some amount of refinement of focus, which we get as we inhabit the body and find the subtle core, the vertical core of the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wish I could express to people how beautiful and powerful it is to actually see these processes, because you use the term see, feel, because we all have this different way that we can sense as the release takes place. But what's beautiful is I've seen this kind of cathartic work that you described with the hitting the pillow. I mean, I've seen all sorts of things in my days of studying psychology and spirituality. When you see someone do this release technique with you, I've seen it done with you in front of a group. There's this beautiful sense of dignity and presence that the person has, even as they contact this constriction, which holds a memory and it holds a belief and it holds feelings, right? So you can see that they're very much touching into some aspect of memory that holds pain or, patterning, yet they're holding this deep sense of dignity, of presence while they do that. And that can be quite unlike other psychological work where people are really just perhaps falling apart into the memory or really identified with the aspect of experience, that held all of that pain. And I think in this book, you said something to the effect of to know your wholeness first is so supportive in trauma work. Because what are we afraid of when it comes to contacting these painful experiences is that we're going to fall apart. We're going to lose our shit. We're going to
Right. We're going to be that little 4-year-old again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's really beautiful to see the subtle experience of someone in all of their grace and dignity falling apart and not at all falling apart, being held in wholeness.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Yes, that's another reason that the embodiment work precedes the release work, so that we can really feel that this pathway of constriction, this terror that we might have felt, is just a one small part of ourselves, right? And it still has the little slivers, strangely enough, of that childhood mentality. But at the same time, we have all of this present day mentality and consciousness contact that we've found, right? So that we can actually observe and experience that one part of ourselves with all the feelings, all the age, all the memory, without going regressively into that small child.
Right.
Yeah. Beautiful. I'm with Vanessa. I'm kind of up against wanting to give people the experience of what this is. And of course it's a practice, it's a walking in practice. But I am a little curious, like as we head towards, the end of our time together here a little bit, if there is any practice, obviously not doing the release work, where we're going to guide people into that, but, something that gives people a sense of the difference between inhabiting the body and being aware. Or we had talked earlier about skin, and Vanessa, in that sense of, because I know that a lot of our listeners have that.
Okay. All right. I can do both of those. Yeah. So yes, there's a very, very short little attunement that we can do just to feel the difference between being aware and inhabiting. And then I'll go into the skin. Okay. So here you are. Yeah. If you want, as you're watching this video, rest your hands on your lap and let yourself become aware of your hands. In becoming aware of your hands, you may notice how warm or cold they are, right? Or how tense or relaxed they are, right? Aware of your hands. Now enter into your hands, actually living within them, actually present within the internal space of your hands. So you may be able to feel that difference, right, of being inside the hands. And it's very interesting too, because there's a automatic cohesion, unity that takes place when we enter into one part of ourselves in that way. Often it enters us into whatever part of our wholeness we can access at the moment, right? So even entering into the hands, you may be able to feel that it brings you into your body as a whole. Let's though go right to that. Let's start just as you were in your hands. See if you can be in your feet the same way, present, living within your feet. Real contact. You might need to let the feet soften, sink down into them. Make sure you can stay in your feet as you breathe, that your inhale doesn't lift you up away from your feet, right? That you can really be in your feet and just normally breathing. And now take a moment to feel that you're in your whole body all at once. Now, one of the constrictions that many of us create, if we have a little bit of unpleasant relationship or trauma very, very early in our lives as infants, or birth trauma, or if there's very strong trauma like physical trauma, we might actually constrict the skin. And everywhere that we constrict ourselves, we pull our consciousness away, pull our contact away from that part of ourselves. So we're going to now, right, we're living in our whole body. Feel that you're in your whole body at once, all the way out to your skin. Everywhere, right? It envelops everywhere, every part of you, right? And there's a very subtle breath within it, and there's contact in the skin. everywhere. Sometimes for people who've really contracted very hard in their skin, I suggest feeling for a little while that you have fur, right? Lovely fur. That's all the way out to your skin. And let yourself feel how your skin touches the atmosphere around you in the room. Right? Even the head, even the skull, skin, under our hair. Right? The atmosphere in the room touches your skin, and your skin touches the atmosphere in the room. But also very important that you're not just on the surface of yourselves, but you're living all the way within the depth, the whole internal depth. It's like if we say that the body is the temple, then you're sitting inside the temple with nothing left out, right? All the way to your skin. Now, if your eyes are closed, open them and see if you can still feel that, right? That you have that internal contact with yourself. And of course, be patient with this. This is a practice. It gets more and more easy to do every time you do it. But feel that you're in your whole body with your eyes open now. It's more challenging because the world appears very vivid, but you still have that temple to sit inside all the way to the skin.
Thank you. You know, it's funny. I read that story of the woman in your book about the constricted skin and the growing the fur, and what my imagination wanted to do with that for whatever reason was grow colorful, fluffy feathers.
Oh, feathers. Yes, feathers just as good.
And one of my, because I'm very, historically, my pattern is to be like a moon rock, you know, just like density down on the inside. And it's been really fun to play with that. One of my favorite ways to play with realization process meditations is walking around in the world. And I work in downtown New Haven. So it's also kind of nice in this urban environment. There's people, there's moving cars, there's all that. But it feels so liberating and so relieving to be able to be inside myself. So I'm not pushing myself out like I'm the big colorful bird. You know, I'm inside myself, but that I can feel that sort of fluffy, yummy, feathery. It's exquisite because it's so fun to feel how I walk around in the world so differently. And I remember when I was in the training with you, as I was, you know, with the whole group, sitting in front of the group doing the practice, I often have this experience where when I practice, suddenly I feel like a giant. Like the whole world seems like made of tiny cars and tiny people. I think it's just because my habit has always been to make myself small. Yeah, to compact and condense. So I'm not doing this thing where I'm jutting out my chest, forcing myself out in the space, just inhabiting myself. It's like, whoa, I'm so big in the world. And it's such a good feeling. It just feels so roomy. So I'm just sharing that so that, you know, people can get a sense that, I mean, for me, I'm going to tear up a little bit, but your work, it's given me back a life that I wouldn't have even had a chance to live. You know, like that I can fully inhabit my life and my being. What are words for that? You know, I can't put words to that. So I'll just describe some experiences and hope that people can come along for the ride on that.
Thank you so much.
And know that Judith can feel what you're saying. So it's okay. You don't need the words. It is almost like, now I don't know if you would say it like this, Judith, but it's almost like the end of objectification of ourselves and of others, and that experience that other people objectify us. They can paint on us, they can project on us, but we don't become an object for them.
That's right. That's one of the things that heals, that self-consciousness and that objectification of ourselves dissipates. We actually become the subject, the being looking out at the world rather than the one who's looked at. Yeah.
Yeah. And engaged with a bunch of other beings, which,
That's right.
feels tremendously nice not to be an objectified reality. And I had grown up with parents who were quite firmly in object consciousness. You've said before something to the effect of, as people relate only to the surface of themselves, they can only relate to the surface of you. It's no one's to blame, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then didn't realize I was objectifying. I had no bad intent, because we think of that word culturally and we think like someone's doing something malicious, they're objectifying you, so we always can load it. But it was quite an innocent act of just looking for ways that other things could satisfy me or make me feel a certain way. And in innocence, it was an objectification process. And as you relate deeper to yourself, as I related deeper to myself or inhabited myself, it was like I needed less for my environment. Mm-hmm. I needed my environment. My environment didn't need to prove I was lovable. Mm-hmm. My environment didn't need to do anything in particular for me. Right. It was in that way very intimate, and it's such a relief.
Yes. Yes, it's such a relief. Yes. And it's a real, you say that word intimate, it's a real intimacy because it's person to person, subject to subject, person, being to being. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think before we wrap up, and we have time, but I'm saying it like that because that could happen soon. We're talking about this book in particular, Trauma and the Unbound Body. And of course, we're talking about healing some of the constrictions we've developed over the course of our lifetime or maybe before. But also, this is an awakening process. It's a realization process. And I think it'd be worth us bringing something to that because, you said something I just had to write down because our audience will know immediately why I love this quote so much. Okay, you said, enlightenment is not something other than our humanness. It is the fruition of our humanness. It's not an idea about life. It is life itself. You've said words like this. And I think some of our listeners have heard our interview with La Kelly, and you and he bring through something to me, which is like the democratization of awakening, that this isn't just some rarefied state that if you're good enough and penitent enough and you practice enough, you'll get to. It's also not just a miracle of grace. It's not just you're lucky enough or you're not. And I wonder if we could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's very important. This is who we really are. This is who every single one of us really is. So it's right there waiting for anyone who's at all interested in it to open to tap into. It does take a little bit of focus to do it. Just a little bit of work, not much, a little bit. I think, centuries ago, it was considered a very advanced state to get to this, but now it's really not. Now, everyone who has been drawn to this work at all, and I'm sure Locke has the same experience, can do it, can get there, right? They can get there. It's available to us now for whatever reason. So absolutely, and it's not dependent on any sort of other power at all. Right? Or on our, behavior even. It's not something we win. It's something we attune to.
Yeah. And it's worth for all of you listening, if this is like striking a chord and you're finding yourself really intrigued by this, it is worth going to a class or doing a teleclass, either with Judith or one of the other practitioners, or having a session, because one of the things I misunderstood early on, and you speak about it in your books, but it is so experiential, was that I was feeling myself as energy.
Right.
And mistaking that for the experience of fundamental consciousness, because that was so easy to me and I could feel energy streaming and all of these things. But to put my words on it, there's a sort of volatility about energy, a sort of instability that wasn't providing that unified ground of experience, or really the awakened experience. And so it's worth people coming, I think, to get some clarification.
Yes, so that's a very important point. This is just one step further, right? I mean, if people have never experienced energy, of course, that's a very important opening, that they're not just a little, bit of matter, separate from everything around them. But most of the people who come to this work have plenty of experience of themselves as energy, of flowing, merging with everything around them, or the volatility of it, or the easily influencedness of being energy. And this is yet one more step subtler to know ourselves as this fundamental ground, which is actually experienced as stillness. When we know ourselves as that stillness, the energy can move through us. We don't lose that, but we have a ground, unbreakable ground, within which to allow that to move, so that we're not blown about by the wind of it, right? Mm. Yeah.
And that ground, I think, is also the place that when we can feel it, we get to actually experience and contact the part of our being that cannot be harmed. It cannot be ruptured. There is something else. There is some ground here. If we're people who've experienced a lot or just engaged deeply in our own healing work, and so we're encountering our patterns a lot, to really also encounter and get intimacy with the place that can't be harmed is in and of itself just tremendously healing.
Yes, that's a wonderful thing about fundamental consciousness. It can't be harmed, and it never has been harmed.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So no matter how badly we feel we've been treated or damaged by our upbringing or things we've been through, there is always this part of ourselves that we can contact that's not damaged. Mm-hmm. Right? That's just waiting there, absolutely whole, glowing, right? Made of love and wisdom and everything, right there waiting for us.
Yeah, this luminescent being, which, most of us can feel depending on the trauma we've been through, broken, irreparably damaged, all of these things. And I have certainly tried to convince people they weren't, and that did nothing. You ever tried to do that? No, you're great. You're whole. You're wonderful.
I tried to convince myself for years and years, talking to myself that way. Not super helpful.
That's right.
This is that. Go ahead.
Yeah. One of the real hard things, I think, for everyone in their healing process is knowing their own love, right? Really finding that love, knowing that they're actually good people. Children, really believe in the just world, I think, and all of us have been yelled at to some extent, criticized to some extent, and accepted that, It's very hard to find that aspect of ourselves that actually is whole and good, right? But when we feel love in our body, there it is, right? That's never been harmed. Right? That's our love.
Yeah. It's so much different to judge an idea. And as you feel like an object, or as you relate to yourself from the side of yourself or above yourself, there's the sense like you're an idea, and then you can get self-critical. You can say just the worst things to yourself, the same way as you might to a TV star you see in a magazine who you've never met in your life, right? There's so much just flatness that you can cast all of these projections on it. But as you come to inhabit yourself, that power you spoke about, Judith, I've experienced myself as isness, as a mountain, as a base, like the kind of strength that's not power over, which is very much a part of your work. It just is. And it's like, I used to read a lot of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he would talk about your basic goodness. Mm-hmm. Or I do Tibetan practices where they talk about being born pure. Right. And I would think, oh God, I wish that idea is true. I hope it's true. Right. I'm going to pretend I believe it's true, fake it till I make it, right?
Which helps a little.
Yeah, right. Which did something, It got me through a lot, but it was still a constant management system, because until the experience landed, I was working it over and over again.
Exactly. That's the difference. Yeah. This is the Buddhists call it self-arising. It's just, once we've attuned to it, we've done a little bit of practice, it's just there. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's the number one thing I should say out loud, because Brooke and I have spoken about your work in exactly this way. it is the end of a management system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for energetically sensitive people, or as you call them, spiritually sensitive people, thank God we get really adept at getting some management tools. Okay, sage yourself after clients, take a hot shower, wash your hands.
Yeah, imagine a golden bubble.
Energetic field.
We're like golden bubble.
Right. And when that's what you got, like, great. Thank God. But then we wonder why people are tiring or client work is tiring. Well, look at what we have to put into it.
Yeah. And our lives get smaller because management is fatiguing. So we manage ourselves into a corner, or we can.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is self-arrival, absolutely effortless. Mm-hmm. Take some effort to get there. And I do want to emphasize that because there's some teachings out there like, well, this is your natural state, so you just relax, have some tea, you're just like that.
Right.
But that's not exactly true, because it is a letting go of ourselves, but it's a letting go from deep within.
Yeah.
For us to let go and land in this effortless place that's both unified within and unified with everything else, we need to let go of ourselves from deep within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And for that, we need a little bit of focused practice. Not a whole lot, but a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that's worth saying, Judith, just so people don't go and do a practice and say like, well, how come I'm not, getting it or something? It's like, even when we did the training with you, and Brooke and I are pretty in tune people, it's like, it almost felt fatiguing to bring the level of focus and find the tension. Yeah. And, quite frankly, I was facing some really painful stuff that would come up when I brought my focus into inhabiting my body.
That's right.
Right.
That's
so
right.
It's not just this, only this easeful process. It's just that we've all experienced pain before, but we've experienced pain ungrounded sometimes, dissociatively fighting it, resisting it. There's something very different about experiencing some of these traumatic patterns from this level of ground. Or, for example, one of the things that was real for me when I did the training was I couldn't inhabit my pelvis. And to do it with your support, was a very different thing for me to be able to find safety there. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to look at people and see if I could still find safety. I mean, these are, like Brooke was saying, these are practices.
Yes.
But the beauty is that somehow, some way, you start to get glimpses, right? Tastes and experiences. And then it organically seemed to evolve to, we got interviewed the other day and someone was asking me like, oh, so do you find you're in your body now, or do you have to keep bringing yourself home? And I was like, oh no. I mean, to some extent, and you said you only need 75, 80% before you can realize something profound. Like, to some extent, I'm here all the time now.
Yes.
And I saw that. I dissociated from a trigger. Holy cow, I never dissociate anymore. It was so cool to do it. I could see, I rose up, I was looking over, and I'm like,
You'll never lose that ability.
Right. But now you can watch it when it happens and be like, that pattern. Oh my gosh. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It ripens. It simply ripens, and then you're just there.
Mm-hmm.
Home.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judith.
Is beautiful. We could talk to you obviously for hours, since we did a whole training with you, and I have 12 more questions written down on a piece of paper.
We have a multi-page printout we're working off of, which we didn't look at, but that's fine. We'll do part 2, 3, and 4 somewhere down the road.
It felt like you asked just the right questions to me. This is really the essence of the work. If I wanted to just sit and do a tape of this, I think this is what I would want to say. Okay. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, good. Because we are so appreciative of you. We have such good feelings about your work, and we're such advocates. So, then we feel like we honored you, which is really meaningful to us. And, we do this show so that people can find resources like yourself and new ways of experiencing themselves in the world. So if we can honor you, it's makes my heart happy.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned in this episode, live at blissandgrit.com. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. When you head over there, you can donate to the show, which we so appreciate, and also get rewards for your support. If you've been wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, it is the place to go for a more immersive experience. You can also come hang with us on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe on the website, which again is blissandgrit.com, if you want to get our weekly digest of what resources we're currently loving or announcements for new blog posts. Brooke and I both also see clients, and you can get all of that information on the website. We are so grateful to each and every one of you for being on this journey with us, for all of the reviews that so many of you have taken a moment to write. They really do help us out. And most especially for the membership support that so many of you have provided. It really keeps us going, and we have so much appreciation and gratitude for you. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful week. Till next week.